She had destroyed 15 assistants in 8 months. Some lasted hours, one lasted 15 minutes. The employment agencies had started refusing her calls. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, a single father with an empty bank account and a 6-year-old daughter counting on him walked through her front door. Not because he believed he could survive her, but because he had absolutely no other choice. What happened next would cost them both everything they thought they knew about pain, pride, and what it means to let another person in. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain came down hard that morning. The kind that didn't care about umbrellas or good intentions. The kind that soaked through a heavy canvas jacket in under 30 seconds and left a person standing in a cold puddle inside their own shoes. I stood on the wet sidewalk outside the imposing iron gates of the coastal estate, looking up at the structure, and felt the distinct, heavy weight of being somewhere I probably shouldn't be. It wasn't just a house. It was an absolute statement. 5 stories of reinforced concrete, tinted glass, and pale granite rose from the cliffside, overlooking the gray, churning waves of the Atlantic. It was situated in the kind of private enclave where the residents didn't put their trash bins out until the exact hour of pickup because they didn't want to ruin the neighborhood's pristine geometrical aesthetics. The kind of neighborhood where people like me didn't stop. We passed through, delivered packages in the rain, and then left immediately. I checked the address on my phone again, my thumb wiping away the water droplets from the screen. My name is Caleb Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and I live with my 6-year-old daughter, Tess, in a drafty 2-bedroom apartment above an old dry cleaning shop on the industrial fringes of the city. By trade, I am a neural prosthetic engineer, a specialist in brain-computer interfaces. I had spent a decade in clean rooms and research labs, designing the microelectrode arrays that allowed paralyzed patients to bridge the gap between their minds and their bodies. But 3 years ago, my research partners at my former firm betrayed me. They fabricated a series of data theft charges, seized my patents, and terminated my contract under a non-disclosure agreement that effectively blacklisted my name from the entire medical technology industry. I went from directing a $20 million laboratory to repairing broken laptops and restoring discarded electronics in a damp basement workshop just to buy groceries. I didn't care about the lost prestige or the stolen millions, but I cared about Tess. Tess had been born with a profound auditory neuropathy condition. She was completely deaf, but she possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity to electromagnetic fields and mechanical vibrations. She could place her small palm against a running engine or a computer tower and feel the static vo-vo hum of a circuit that was failing. Her critical cochlear implant surgery, the only medical procedure that could connect her to the world of sound, was 3 months overdue. The clinic had sent their final notice, and my bank account was holding exactly $47 after the monthly rent cleared. The listing had been my only option. Personal care assistant and technical liaison to Helena DuPont, CEO of DuPont Neurotech. The salary was astronomical, enough to fund Tess's surgery, her therapy, and pay off our debts in a single month. But the warnings from the agency had been brutal. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Brooks," the woman at the agency had said, her voice dropping as if she were sharing a terminal diagnosis. "We have placed 15 individuals in this role over the past 8 months, and none of them are still employed. Most of them resigned within 48 hours. The client has exceptionally high standards, and she is not easy to work with." I took the job anyway. I packed my grandfather's double-jointed steel tools into my tattered canvas bag, strapped Tess into her seat, and let our dog, Beamer, climb into the cab beside her. Beamer was a retired medical alert and therapy Labrador retriever with a slightly gray muzzle. He had a permanent hitching limp from an old military blast injury, but his senses were sharper than any laboratory computer. He could smell the subtle chemical shifts in a person's sweat, the sudden spike in cortisol, and warn of an incoming neurological seizure 30 seconds before the physical muscle spasms ever began. I pressed the intercom button at the massive iron gate. A clipped, female voice answered, carrying the exact tone of someone who had been interrupted from something more important. "You're late." I checked my phone. It was 7:46 a.m. "My appointment is at 8, I said, keeping my voice calm. I said 7:45 in the confirmation, she replied flatly. The gate is open. The front door was opened by a woman in her late 50s with careful eyes and the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to make themselves very small. She introduced herself as Mrs. Polson, the housekeeper, in a whisper, and led us through a foyer of clean, expensive emptiness into a wide, glass-walled office that overlooked the cliffs. And there, behind a white marble desk that probably cost more than my apartment, was Helena DuPont. She was 34 years old, her dark hair pulled back into an immaculate tight bun with no loose strands. She wore a tailored black wool blazer draped over her shoulders, her face beautiful, sharp, and entirely devoid of any softness. Her pale blue eyes, cold as the winter sea, flicked toward me with the studied neutrality of a queen preparing to dismiss an ordinary man. She was in a wheelchair. She was completely paralyzed from the neck down, her high-tech motorized chair controlled entirely by her eye movements and her custom-designed SomaLink neural implant cased in the carbon fiber headrest behind her neck. Standing beside her was Dr. Gregory Kincaid, the 45-year-old chief of science at DuPont. He was expensively groomed, wearing a white laboratory coat over a bespoke silk shirt, his face carrying the smooth, patronizing confidence of a man who believed he was the only genius in the room. Your resume is ordinary, Mr. Brooks, Helena said, her voice carrying a dry, metallic clarity that was modulated through her chair's computer speakers. Administrative support, logistics coordination, minor field maintenance, nothing particularly impressive. And you have a child. I do, I said. The listing didn't restrict candidates with children. Children create complications, she snapped, her eyes narrowing slightly. School pickups, sick days, emergencies. I need someone whose attention is not divided. I cannot have an assistant leaving in the middle of a critical project because of a fever or a school play. My daughter is 6, I said, my voice remaining an anchor of calm in the silent room. She is healthy, and I have already arranged backup coverage for every scenario I can anticipate. If something comes up I haven't anticipated, I will handle it without it affecting your schedule. Kincaid let out a sharp, mocking laugh from behind her chair. You think you're prepared, Mr. Brooks? The last 15 assistants we employed had doctoral degrees in biomedical administration. They lasted days. What makes you think you can survive here? Because I need the work, I said, looking Dr. Kincaid directly in the eye. And because I'm the only assistant in this building who knows that your SomaLink implant is currently running on a modified 5 Hz frequency that is slowly causing her neck muscles to spasm. The room went dead silent. Kincaid's hand froze over his tablet. What did you just say? Helena whispered, her pale blue eyes locking onto mine with a sudden dangerous intensity. The cooling fan behind your neck is running at 9,000 revolutions per minute, I said, pointing to the tiny, blue-glowing port behind her headrest. That means the processor is overheating because the digital signal is fighting a physical feedback loop in your upper spine. If your engineers don't adjust the alignment in 30 seconds, you're going to have a seizure. This is preposterous, Kincaid shouted, his face turning a sharp, ugly shade of red as he gestured toward the door. He's a civilian. He's trying to sabotage the system. Security! But before he could finish, Beamer stood up on his 3 legs, his gray muzzle lifting toward Helena's chair. He let out a sharp, sudden bark, his tail tucking tight as he began to scratch frantically at the carpet near her wheels. Beamer, stay, I called out softly. A microsecond later, Helena's eyes flared with a sudden, terrifying panic. Her jaw went rigid, her breathing turning into a shallow, desperate gasp as her head snapped back against the rest. Her body began to shudder with a violent, agonizing neurological spasm. He's poisoned her, Kincaid screamed, backing away from the thrashing wheelchair. He's uploaded a virus. Security, put him on the floor. The heavy double doors burst open and 3 armed guards lunged toward me. I didn't fight them. I let them grab my arms and slam me onto the cold Carrara marble, my cheek pressed against the slick stone. But as I lay there, my eyes remained locked on the cooling fan behind Helena's neck, hearing the silent, high-pitched, vo-vo hum of the hacked frequency. Tess ran into the room, ignoring the guards, her small hand reaching out to touch the carbon fiber frame of Helena's headrest. She looks down at me, her deep, dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and absolute technical understanding, her fingers rapidly signing against her palm. The machine is singing the wrong song, Papa. It's hurting her. Let me up, I yelled to the guard, pinning my shoulder. I can stop the feedback loop. Her own engineers are killing her. The guard's heavy knee pressed harder into my left shoulder blade, the cold Carrara marble biting into my cheek as the crimson warning lights from Helena's wheelchair flashed across the floor like a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Dr. Kincaid was backing toward the office door, his face a sweating, pale mask of frantic self-preservation, already gesturing for the standby medical team in the corridor. The implant is in a cascading lock, Kincaid screamed over the shrill hum of the diagnostic alarms. His presence disrupted the wireless calibration. Officer Reed, drag him out of here. If her respiration drops below 80%, the board will hold us all criminally negligent. Tess didn't move. She stood on her small, scuffed sneakers, her hands flat against the cold carbon fiber headrest of the wheelchair, her hazel eyes wide and unblinking as she stared directly into the thrashing, agonizing face of the paralyzed CEO. Despite her deafness, my daughter was reading the machine's physical vibrations through her fingertips, her body perfectly still, absorbing the high-frequency tremors that were locking Helena's neck muscles into a rigid, painful knot. Helena's eyes, wild with a suffocating, clawing terror, flicked toward her eye-tracking monitor mounted to the armrest. The infrared cameras struggled to register her pupils through the violent trembling of her head. But with a final, desperate surge of willpower, she focused her gaze on a single red icon at the bottom of the screen. A synthetic, digitized voice stuttered out of the chair's cooling vents, the syllables chopped and broken. Release him. Now. Officer Reed hesitated, his grip on my shoulder loosening just enough for me to twist my head. But Ms. DuPont, the security protocol, release him, the synthetic voice commanded again, this time with a sharp, digital volume that silenced the room. The guard stepped back, releasing my arms. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles aching, but I didn't waste a second. I lunged for my tattered canvas tool bag on the floor, tearing open the brass buckle. I bypassed the standard steel screwdrivers and pulled out a long, thin, non-conductive ceramic-tipped alignment tool, one of the custom instruments my grandfather had hand-carved from aviation-grade composite decades ago. "Clara!" I shouted to the young assistant who was staring in terror from the doorway. "Reach behind the lower left panel of the headrest. There's a manual ground shunt port hidden beneath the leather casing. Press it and hold it down." "Don't touch that panel!" Kincaid yelled, stepping forward, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "That is a proprietary, sealed, high-voltage component. If you trigger a static discharge, you'll fry her neural receiver." "The receiver is already frying, Kincaid," I snapped, my hand moving with microscopic precision as I aligned the ceramic tip of my tool with a tiny, circular calibration port behind Helena's left ear. "The wireless receiver is taking 24 volts of direct current because your team forgot to isolate the auxiliary charging circuit from the signal bus." I didn't wait for Kincaid's permission. I inserted the ceramic tool into the port. Click. The tip found the tiny hand-sprung frequency dial inside the core movement, a hidden mechanical redundancy that I had personally written into the patent blueprints of the original SomaLink prototypes years ago, before my former partners stole them. "Tess," I said, not looking back, "tell me when the hum changes." Tess kept her palm pressed against the carbon fiber frame. She closed her eyes, her head tilting 3 degrees to the left as she felt the deep frequency vibration running through the metal. I turned the ceramic tool a fraction of a millimeter to the left. "Vo," Tess signed with her left hand, her fingers mimicking a fast, jagged wave. "Too high." I turned it back, slowly, precisely, adjusting the mechanical balance of the signal against the heat of the processor. "Vo," Tess signed, her hand smoothing out into a slow, gentle wave. "It's sleeping." The shrill diagnostic alarms on the console abruptly died. The crimson flashing lights turned a solid, peaceful amber. Helena's head slowly relaxed against the headrest, her chin dropping as the violent, suffocating muscle spasms in her neck ceased. Her chest rose and fell in a deep, shuddering gasp of cold, air-conditioned oxygen. The quiet that followed was absolute. Dr. Kincaid stood frozen, his hand still holding his tablet, his prestigious lab coat looking suddenly very empty. He looked at the diagnostic monitor on the wall, where the signal frequency line had smoothed out into a clean, nominal 32 Hz wave. The feedback loop is gone, Clara whispered, her hand slowly releasing the lower leather panel, her face wide with a mixture of shock and profound, humbling respect. The current has dropped to 0.02 amperes. The core temperature is cooling down. It was a critical power surge, Kincaid stammered, his voice thin and hollow as he tried to adjust his tailored cuffs. A predictable temporary neural decay spike. The wireless diagnostic team in Chicago must have adjusted the parameters on their end. This technician's intervention had nothing to do with it. I stood up, sliding my ceramic tool back into my canvas bag, and looked Kincaid directly in the eyes. "The power surge came from your own server, Doctor," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the heavy, solid weight of an iron bar. The Soma link didn't fail because of a natural spike. It was fed a continuous 5 Hz subcarrier frequency designed to mimic an active seizure, a frequency that was uploaded through an executive digital key at 9:15 this morning. I looked at the primary console screen, where the raw, unredacted telemetry log was still cycling. "A key that was registered to your private laboratory terminal, Kincaid," I added. Kincaid's face went completely, utterly white. The sweat on his forehead was now glistening under the cold halogen lights of the ceiling. He began to back toward the door, his hands trembling so violently he had to stuff them into his pockets to hide his panic. "This is an absurd, malicious accusation," Kincaid hissed, looking at the security guards. "Reed, arrest him. He's a former employee of our rival firm. He's a saboteur." "Stand down, Alistair," Helena said, her voice dropping into a low, metallic purr that made the guards freeze instantly. She turned her wheelchair to face Kincaid, her pale blue eyes, cold as harbor ice, locking onto his sweating face. She didn't need to move her hands to command respect. The sheer, unyielding force of her mind was enough to hold the room. "I'm having my internal security team pull the digital access logs for your terminal, Gregory," she said softly. "If I find that 5 Hz subcarrier code on your server, I will have the federal marshals arrest you for grand larceny and attempted murder before your lunch hour is finished." She looked at the guard. "Reed, escort Dr. Kincaid to the security lounge. Keep him there until the investigation is complete." As the guards moved in to lead the sweating, silent scientist away, Helena turned her chair to face me. She looked at the tattered canvas bag in my hand, then down at the scruffy gray jacket of my daughter Tess, who was still holding her plush gear wheel under her arm. "You're Caleb Brooks," Helena said, her voice carrying a rare, quiet curiosity. "The engineer they erased from the Mars Nexus project 3 years ago." "My name is Caleb, yes," I said, my voice level. "But I'm just your new assistant, Ms. DuPont. I believe the job listing mentioned 15 previous employees walked out because they couldn't handle your standards." Helena looked at Tess, who was now quietly drawing a picture of the sea through the glass window on her pad. "I don't care about my standards, Caleb," Helena said, "but I care about the hands that can touch a machine without breaking it. You have the job. Come back tomorrow at 7:30. I picked up my tool bag and took Tess's hand. "We'll be here at 7:15, Ms. DuPont." The first month of working at the DuPont estate was a quiet, grueling lesson in the architecture of human defenses. I arrived every morning at exactly 7:15, the cool coastal mist still clinging to the granite steps of the main entrance, with Tess holding my hand and Beamer hopping faithfully at our side. We established our routine without a single word of discussion, our paths through the wide, sterile marble corridors quickly hardening into a trail we both knew the exact edges of. Helena was still the tyrant the employment agencies had warned me about. She did not apologize for the guards who had pinned me to the floor on our first morning, nor did she soften the sharp, precise targets of her criticism. If my daily summary report was formatted in an 11-point font instead of the 12-point she preferred, she would point it out with the clinical distance of an editor correcting a typo. If I placed her morning tea 3 inches too far to the right of her eye-tracking sensor array, she would remind me of my structural incompetence in front of the junior staff. But the attacks had changed shape. They were no longer designed to break me, to drive me out of her house like the 15 assistants before me. They were targeted, precise, and practical. It was her way of testing the load-bearing walls, of verifying whether the man who had stopped her seizure in under 30 seconds was actually strong enough to hold the weight of her world. And she was watching me. Not with warmth. She did not do warmth in the daylight, but with the quiet, intense curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment she couldn't quite explain. I settled into the work, letting my background as a bioengineer guide the logistics of her life. I consolidated her chaotic medical calendar, rearranged her physical therapy schedules, and took over the administration of her medication logs from Mrs. Paulson. I spent my evenings in our small apartment upstairs, going through the deep system code of her SomaLink interface, identifying the places where Kincaid's developers had taken shortcuts to meet the board's market deadlines. I didn't tell her I was doing this, I just quietly uploaded the anti-frequency patches to her chair's terminal during the night shifts while the estate was silent. Tess settled into her own rhythm too. She had set up her travel art kit by the massive bay windows of the office, her colored pencils arranged in a neat, perfect spectrum on the floor. She worked in absolute silence, her small face focused on her drawings of the sea, the cliffs, and the massive container ships that moved across the horizon. When the noise of the office became too loud, she would put her noise-canceling headphones around her neck and simply watch the world. She wasn't afraid of Helena. To Tess, the high-tech, motorized wheelchair was not a symbol of tragedy or limitations. It was just a very interesting piece of mechanical geometry. At least twice a day, she would walk over to Helena's desk, her small fingers touching the carbon fiber headrest to feel the quiet, vo-vo vibration of the cooling fan. Helena never ordered her away. She would go still, her pale blue eyes tracking the girl's movements across her screen, her jaw set in a hard line that was trying not to soften. The first real corporate storm arrived on a Thursday morning near the end of the second week. An email came through the executive inbox, flagged urgent, from a board member named Gerald Finch. Finch was the kind of man who carried the title of senior advisor, but operated with the predatory ambition of a majority owner. He had been quietly working the board of directors for months, using the ongoing delays in the SomaLink 2.0 development to build a case against Helena's leadership. The email was a formal proposal for a new Executive Oversight Committee, a carefully, politely worded document that would, if ratified, strip Helena of her direct veto power over the company's product line. It was a corporate cage. It didn't remove her as CEO, it just installed a ceiling above her wheelchair. Helena read the document on her tablet, her face going a shade of pale that matched the white marble of her desk. She didn't scream. She didn't call for her legal team. She simply went completely, absolutely still. The kind of stillness that meant her mind was running calculations she didn't want anyone to see. Finch has been building this since September, she said, her voice dropping into a flat, factual murmur that was modulated through her computer speakers. The delayed Q3 filings, the legal disputes in Chicago, he's been cataloging every misstep to present to the board on the 17th of next month. He wants to prove my physical limitations are creating operational instability. He's not trying to correct underperformance, Ms. DuPont, I said, standing near the window with her daily correspondence folder. He's trying to capture the value of your overperformance. The SomaLink 2.0 is nearly complete, and he wants the credit before the launch. She looked at me, her blue eyes narrowing. You're very confident about board politics for an independent IT contractor, Caleb. I've never sat in a boardroom, I said. But I've spent 3 years watching people try to take things from those who built them. The tactics are always the same. You don't respond to his narrative, you show up with a better one. And what's my narrative? We present the 3-year trend data for the bioneural division, I said, opening a folder on my tablet. We show that since your accident, our patient recovery margins have risen by 12%. We show them the prototype for the adaptive interface I've been testing on your chair, the one that doesn't rely on his outdated Chicago server, but runs on a localized, self-stabilizing loop. We put the actual code on the table before he can even frame the question of your stability. Helena stared at me, her hand-gloved arms resting limply on her lap, her breathing slightly rapid. For 5 seconds, the silence in the room was so thick, I could hear the wind off the cliffs rattling the outer glass. Then she turned her eyes back to her screen. Prepare the summary document, Caleb. I want the draft in my inbox by the end of Wednesday. "I'll have it by Tuesday," I said, and went back to my desk. The physical therapy sessions changed after that. Marcus, her therapist, a large, professionally unbothered man who had been working with her for 2 years, started coming 3 times a week instead of 2. The sessions in the second-floor medical room became longer, the sounds of the pneumatic lift and the low, strained hum of the bionic harness echoing through the hallway. One afternoon, I passed the door on my way to check the main server terminal. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't slow my pace, but as I passed, I heard Helena's voice, low, ragged, and completely stripped of her executive shield. "I did it. Don't make a thing of it, Marcus." Marcus's voice was calm, slow. "I'm not making a thing of it. I'm writing it down because it's 31 seconds, Helena. That's a record." "Write it down faster then," she gasped, her breathing labored. "Before my legs remember they aren't supposed to hear me." I kept walking. I didn't tell her I had heard. I didn't mention the 31 seconds during our end-of-day briefing. But that evening, when I set the summary documents on her desk, I placed them exactly 2 inches closer to her left hand than usual, within the narrow range of motion she had been working to reclaim. She looked at the papers, then up at me, her cold blue eyes holding a look that had no name yet. It wasn't the Bao Tua look anymore, and it wasn't the cold mask. It was something older and more unguarded, the look of a person who had spent 2 years locked behind a stone wall and had just seen the first crack in the gate. She didn't move the papers. She didn't correct my formatting. She simply looked back at her screen and whispered, "Thank you, Caleb." "You're welcome, Ms. DuPont," I said, and let the silence carry us into the evening. December arrived with a bitter, unforgiving freeze that turned the coastal Atlantic into a jagged, slate-gray mirror. The wind, howling off the cliffs, rattled the heavy glass windows of the DuPont estate, but inside the office, we had built a different kind of warmth. The high-voltage tension of the first few weeks had settled into a quiet, functional rhythm. I had started bringing her a simple breakfast plate every morning at 8, Mrs. Polson's soft scrambled eggs and rye toast, setting it on the corner of her desk without her asking. For the first 3 weeks, she had ignored it, letting the steam dissipate into the cold, conditioned air of the room while she reviewed her European market projections. But by the 4th week, she had stopped fighting it. She would open her laptop, her pale blue eyes fixed on her emails, and slowly eat with her mouth set in a hard, stubborn line. It was her way of accepting my presence without having to admit she was letting her guard down. The real shift happened on a Friday, when Tess's school closed early for the winter holidays. I had no backup coverage, my mother being at a medical appointment, so I had no choice but to bring her to the estate. I told Helena before we walked through the door. I wouldn't bring my daughter into her workspace without warning. "How old is she?" Helena had asked, her eyes never leaving her monitor. 6, I replied. "She has her drawing supplies. She won't be a distraction." "Bring her in," she said flatly. Tess walked into the massive marble office with her small backpack and her scruffy gray plush penguin, her deep dark eyes immediately taking inventory of the room without any of the self-consciousness adults usually carried. She looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the high ceiling, and then, without hesitation, she walked straight to Helena's wheelchair. I held my breath, my hand instinctively reaching out, but Tess simply stopped 3 inches away. She looked at the high-tech armrest, then up at Helena's sharp, noble face. "Why do you have a big chair with wheels?" Tess signed with her hands, her movements slow and clear. Helena stared at my daughter. For 3 seconds, her face went through a rapid, silent calculation. The expression of a woman who had spent 2 years answering that exact question with cold, defensive armor, now looking at a child who had no judgment in her eyes. "I had an accident," Helena said, her voice dropping into a quiet, unhurried register that was modulated through her chair's speakers. "Like falling off a bicycle, but much bigger. My legs don't hear me when I tell them to move." Tess processed this with a child's solemn gravity. She reached out and touched the carbon fiber frame of the headrest, closing her eyes for a moment to feel the steady, warm, vo-vo hum of the cooling fan. She opened her eyes, looked at Helena, and signed, "It's a very loud machine, but it's trying to help you. I can draw a picture of it." "You can draw whatever you want," Helena said softly. Tess sat down cross-legged on the floor by the window, her colored pencils spread around her like a bright wooden fan, and began to draw. She worked in absolute silence, and Helena worked at her desk, and I worked at mine. The room held all three of us in a way that should have been strange, but felt like a foundation finally settling into place. At noon, Mrs. Polson appeared in the doorway, carrying 3 plates of grilled cheese and tomato soup. I looked at the 3 plates, my chest feeling an odd, warm tightness that I chose not to examine. We ate our lunch in silence, but for the first time, it wasn't the silence of an endurance test. It was the quiet of a shared sanctuary. By 3 in the afternoon, Tess had fallen asleep in the large leather reading chair by the window, her head tipped sideways, her plush penguin tucked under her arm. I walked over and gently covered her with my gray canvas jacket. Helena watched me from across the room, her eyes more unguarded than I had ever seen them. "She trusts you completely," Helena said, her voice quiet enough not to wake the child. "She's 6, I whispered. "She has to." "No," Helena said, looking at the drawing Tess had left on her desk. A sketch of the ocean with a small, orange monarch butterfly flying toward the sun, signed Tess in the lower corner. "She tracks you. She knows who her anchor is because she's already lost her mother. She's brave because she knows you won't let her fall." She looked at her own hands, resting limply on her lap. "I don't remember how to do that," she whispered. "I've been holding onto this chair like it's the only thing keeping me from disappearing." "The chair is just the metal, Helena," I said, walking closer to her desk. "It's not the person sitting in it. The boardroom on the 17th doesn't care about your legs. They care about your mind. And Finch is about to realize he underestimated the only queen in this city." She looked up at me, and the look that had replaced her Bao Chua mask was fully there now. A deep, mutual understanding between 2 people who had both survived a shipwreck and were trying to rebuild a home from the pieces left behind. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. The crisis broke on the eve of the board meeting. At 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, an anonymous leak appeared on the local business feeds. It was a partial, highly manipulated medical log of Helena's near-fatal seizure from our first morning, accompanied by a statement from Dr. Kincaid, who had been released on bail, claiming that Helena's cognitive functions were rapidly deteriorating due to the constant, painful neural spasms of the soma link. It was Finch's final card. He had timed the leak perfectly, giving us less than 12 hours to respond before the board convened to vote on the Executive Oversight Committee. "It's a coordinated strike," Dr. Clara said, her fingers flying across her laptop as she sat with me at the office desk. "He's using the public fear of neurological implants to force the board's hand. If we can't prove she's physically and mentally stable tomorrow, the vote will pass unconditionally." Helena sat at her desk, her face set in a hard, dangerous line of determination. She looked at her tablet, then at the physical therapy harness hanging from the rack in the corner of the room. "I'm not going to write a response, Clara," Helena said, her voice cold as ice. "And I'm not going to hide behind a screen on a video call. I'm going to that boardroom, and I'm going to stand." Clara gasped. "Helena, no! Your record is 31 seconds in a controlled room with Marcus holding your harness. If your legs spasm in front of the board, it'll be a catastrophe." "The localized, self-stabilizing loop Caleb coded has eliminated the signal feedback," Helena said, her eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding, terrifying trust. "The muscles are ready, Clara. They just need the right commander." She looked at me. "Can the Soma Link handle the load, Caleb?" I stood up, my hand resting on the tattered canvas tool bag on my desk. I knew the risks. If the frequency fluctuated by even 1 hertz, her legs would buckle, and she would fall in front of her worst critics. But I looked at her eyes, the fire of a woman who had spent 30 years fighting to be heard, and I knew she was ready to jump. "The code is solid, Helena," I said, "and I'll be standing right behind your chair. I won't let you fall." The double oak doors of the grand boardroom swung open with a quiet, heavy groan, letting in the sterile, tension-filled silence of the top floor. The room was a vast expanse of glass and polished mahogany, dominated by a 30-foot conference table where 12 members of the board sat under the cold glow of recessed lights. At the head of the table stood Gerald Finch, his charcoal overcoat draped over his chair, his hands resting flat on the mahogany as he reviewed a slide of the leaked medical telemetry. The moment Helena's motorized wheelchair crossed the threshold, every eye in the room locked onto her. Behind her, I walked in my clean gray work shirt, my fingers holding the small, copper-plated tool in my pocket. Dr. Clara followed 3 steps behind, carrying her silver laptop like a shield. "Helena," Gerald Finch said, his voice carrying a smooth, well-rehearsed tone of regret that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I'm glad you could join us, though given the severe cognitive instability noted in the recent medical leak, we were prepared to conduct this vote in your absence to spare you the strain. The motion for the Executive Oversight Committee has already been moved to a vote." "The medical leak was a localized digital hack, Gerald," Helena said, her voice quiet but carrying an icy metallic weight that cut through the room's whispers. "A hack that was paid for through a Delaware shell company registered to your sister's home address." Finch's face went instantly rigid, his fingers tightening against the mahogany. "This is an outrageous, desperate deflection. The board cannot ignore the physical reality of your condition, Helena. You cannot even stand to address your directors, let alone run a $20 billion technology enterprise." Helena did not answer him. She looked back at me, her pale blue eyes holding mine with a silent, absolute command. I reached into my pocket, tapped the screen of my smartphone, and initiated the localized, self-stabilizing bypass loop we had uploaded to her headrest. Click. The tiny blue glowing fan behind her neck began to hum at a quiet, perfect 32 hertz. Helena placed her gloved hands on the edge of the mahogany table. Slowly, with a deep, shuddering intake of oxygen, she began to lift her weight. It was a physical effort that required every ounce of willpower her body possessed, her shoulders shaking under the slate-gray blazer, the muscles in her legs screaming as they fired under the raw, bionic current of the SomaLink. 4, 5. Finch took a step back, his mouth opening in absolute silent shock. The board members stood up from their leather chairs, their glasses trembling in their hands, their eyes wide with a disbelief that bordering on awe. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Helena stood. She stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the table for balance, looking down at Gerald Finch and the board of directors from the exact same height they had used to look down on her. At the far end of the room, Dr. Clara opened her laptop and projected the forensic audit onto the central wall screen. The slide did not show her medical failure. It showed the transaction records, the wireless signal logs from Kincaid's terminal, and the 5 Hz subcarrier frequency Finch had purchased to force her neck muscles to spasm. "The vote to restructure executive authority is denied, Gerald," Helena said, her voice entirely steady, her breathing calm as she stood before her empire. "And the board is initiating a full criminal investigation into your acquisition accounts by tomorrow morning. Officer Reed, escort Mr. Finch to the lobby." Finch did not speak. His face was a pale, sweating mask of absolute ruin as the security guards took his arms and led him through the heavy double doors into the quiet of the corridor. Helena stood for exactly 42 seconds, a new record, before she slowly, gracefully lowered herself back into her chair. She did not apologize for her body. She did not flinch. She simply turned her eyes toward Clara and said, "Draft the formal resolution. We are establishing the private trust fund for Tess Brooks's medical treatment today." She looked at me, her blue eyes reflecting the quiet amber light of the room. "And we are appointing Caleb Brooks as our new chief of neural engineering. On your terms, Caleb." I looked at the screen, then at the master keycard Clara had laid on my workbench. I felt the grinding 3-year weight of my stolen career and my empty bank account finally lift from my shoulders. "The terms are simple, Ms. DuPont," I said, a small, quiet smile touching my lips. "The work is about the people, not the board. I'll be in the lab on Monday." The winter storm had cleared by the last week of January, leaving the harbor sky over Boston a brilliant, clean blue that caught the golden light of the late afternoon. Inside our small, warm apartment above the dry cleaning shop, the air smelled of wood polish, hot tea, and the sweet lavender Mrs. Polson had sent over. A vintage transistor radio on the shelf played a slow, unhurried jazz station, the volume low enough not to disturb the quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, my grandfather's black walnut pocket watch lying on a clean velvet cloth before me. I had fully restored the balance wheel and the hand-sprung hairspring, winding the stem until I felt the mechanical tension catch. Tess sat in her small wooden chair, her new post-operative headbands removed, her hair tied up neatly. Beside her on the table sat the gold, platinum tungsten pen Helena had gifted her, and her drawing pad was open to a picture of our new lab, a sketch of an orange monarch butterfly flying over a white, clean building, signed Tess in her careful 6-year-old hand. The pocket watch began to tick, a clean, sharp, musical tick-tick-tick that was so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room with a sense of perfect, unhurried peace. Tess slowly placed her small palm flat against the wooden table, her eyes closing as she felt the microscopic, rhythmic vibration of the clock's heart humming through the wood. Then she opened her deep, intelligent eyes, looked at me, and let out a soft, beautiful sound. A real, spoken word that was the very first sound she had ever heard in her life. "Papa," I smiled, my eyes wet with a long-awaited warmth, and wrapped my arm around her shoulder as we watched the gold hands move across the face of our history, running perfectly.